Hey everybody, KMO here. And what I'm going to share with you first is just the text of an open letter that's going to be published in Harper's Magazine in the October issue. I learned about this on Rising. Sagar and Jetty did a radar on it. So here it is. A letter on justice and open debate, July 7th, 2020. The below letter will be appearing in the letters section of the magazine's October issue. We welcome responses at letters@harpers.org. Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful interests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. But resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, which right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. The democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counterspeech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders, in a spirit of panicked damage control, are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk and aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we won't defend the very thing upon which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us. All right, now to Twitter. Steve Godfrey, who I interviewed either for the C-Realm podcast or for one of these videos, or maybe it was for the podcast and he's part of it on a video. But anyway, he's a British guy of about my age, Gen Xer. He lives in Japan, and he's into antinatalism. And he's probably the most congenial, considerate, polite, like normal person that I've ever talked to, who's also not only knows about antinatalism, but actually favors it. You know, he's a decent person. Or at least he comes across that way in my communications with him. So he retweeted a tweet from Phillipa Sue, who has the blue check mark. I didn't know who she was. I looked her up. She's in the cast of the Broadway musical Hamilton. which I've never seen. I listened to the soundtrack a couple times. It didn't really grab me, but I really liked the songs in Moana, which were written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who also wrote Hamilton. And Hamilton is available for streaming on Disney Plus now. And of course, I have Disney Plus for The Mandalorian and Clone Wars. So I could watch it. It just never rises to the top of the to-watch list. Particularly since my youngest son is here and we are rewatching The Clone Wars, and there's a lot of episodes of The Clone Wars to get through. Anyway, Phillipa Sue writes, cancel culture. If you are canceled, in scare quotes, but do not wish to be, you must work to earn back people's respect by owning up to the thing that canceled you in the first place, comma, ellipse. To which Steve writes, you don't strike me as someone whose respect I care enough about to supplicate for. How about you stop being an ass and stop viewing people with different opinions as prey? And on a similar topic, Steve retweeted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, aka AOC, who tweeted, the term cancel culture comes from entitlement, as though the person complaining has the right to large, captive audience, and one is a victim if people choose to tune them out. Odds are you're not actually canceled, you're just being challenged, held accountable, or unliked. Okay, well, what does that mean, canceled? I mean, could I get canceled? It seems unlikely. Certainly not by the people who use that terminology. If you have a job that pays you money, and say you have a family and a mortgage, and you are dependent, very dependent on the income from that job, and you say something which, is not of the moment, it doesn't pass muster with the cutting edge of the woke crowd, and you lose your job, damn, that sucks. And honestly, I feel for you. Even if you are in a much higher economic strata than I am, if you are suddenly left without the means to maintain your lifestyle, and people that you love who have trusted you to, provide for them, they are left in the lurch because you are no longer able to provide, yeah, that really sucks. Bummer. And, maybe you never did this to anybody else. I do. I genuinely feel compassion for you. If, on the other hand, you have been gleefully canceling other people, and now you have been hoisted on your own petard, well, enjoy. Cheers. By the way, this is just water with lemon juice concentrate. I've noticed when editing audio interviews, there's often the sound of ice clanking in my metal mug here, and it sounds like I'm boozing it up as I'm talking to people, and for the most part, I'm not. The only interview that I've recorded recently in which I was drinking was the one with First, and it's because we started late in the evening, and I was basically sober at the start and not remotely sober at the end. But in listening to it, while I could hear the jingling in the cup, I think I did all right up to the end. Now, most of you haven't heard the end because the end is on the C-ROM Vault podcast. Anyway, in response to AOC, Steve writes, pushback against cancel culture has nothing to do with being challenged, held accountable, or unliked. It's about turning people into prey to be hunted down, chewed up, spat out, and left to rot, increasingly because of decontextualized moments in time caught on video. Yeah. And video is vile, as I speak into the camera. But, I'm not capturing anybody, and I'm certainly not selectively, I'm not taking bits of somebody else's speech out of context and circulating them with the implication that, the full context would paint them as a racist, sexist, transphobe, homophobe, something phobe, whatever. So I tweeted something in response to Steve's response to Phillipa Sue, and I'm not going to read it, but I'll paraphrase it, roughly. It's this: if you've been canceled, if you're like me, if you talk into cameras and microphones or you type whatever, and people who like what you say or write give you money, and then you write or say something that a significant enough portion of your audience doesn't like, they cut off their previous support, and you are, in diminished circumstances, I think the worst thing you could do in that situation would be to try to apologize to them and try to convince them that that was that misstep was out of character, or even worse, you have learned and you are sincerely repentant. And, from this moment on, you will only say things that please them. Man, I would not want to be in that position. I would not want to, like Doug Lane, used to be Diet Soap, now Zero Books. He's the editor, or he's the publisher at Zero Books, but he still does his podcast. It's the same RSS feed, from the Diet Soap podcast. It's just now the Zero Books podcast, and his audience is much, much larger than mine now, which, is a reversal, because for most of the time I've known him, it has been, I've had the larger audience, and he's openly, what's the word I'm looking for? Coveted my audience. Now his audience is bigger, but I suspect he lives in fear of that audience. He is very cautious in what he says, and he has to be, even though I've heard him described. One of his authors was on Rising and named him and said he is a free speech fundamentalist. And as far as I can see, that's pretty true. In fact, what I like about Doug is that, I can get on Skype with him, or we don't do Skype anymore, Zoom, and just to have a normal conversation in my, pre-existing lexicon. I don't have to use all the new, the new speak. We can have just a normal conversation like normal people, and then he can turn around and he can talk to the crowd that uses Newspeak, not so much in their language. He can actually speak to them in normal language that a normal person can follow and understand, which, I think is admirable. That's a skill that I admire. But back to being canceled. My audience now is smaller than it used to be. When my audience was at its largest, it was when I was most consistently preaching doom. I would just, I had read all of Jim Kunstler's books, I had recorded dozens of interviews with him, and I could basically channel Jim Kunstler on command. And there was a significant audience that was hungry for that. And then, as with other ideologies and worldviews before, I just started to notice where the worldview that I was articulating didn't match the actual world that I walked through and experienced with my senses. And the predictions of collapse that the prophets of doom were making back when I was really into this, the late aughts, 2008, 2009, getting into 2010, when those predictions didn't come to pass on schedule, the natural thing to do for a true believer is to just push the date for the apocalypse or the rapture or the collapse or whatever off into the future and say, oh, it's still coming. It's still coming. And, there are plenty of people who are still doing that. And I just, I wasn't going for it. And I started to think, particularly, when I encountered the peak oil meme, I started getting into it. Prior to that, I had been a singularitarian. I had thought that AI, nanotechnology, biotechnology, genetic engineering, all of these were going to synergize and change the world dramatically in a short period in the near future. I didn't have an exact date. I did like Kurzweil, and I don't know what his date was, early 2030s, I think. We're not there yet. But I was also on the Terence McKenna tip, and I was acutely interested in December 21st, 2012, and half expecting big things to happen on that day. My expectations diminished as the day approached, and the world looked pretty normal. But eventually, what really compelled me about the peak oil collapse narrative was that I, still thought that technology had this particular trajectory, particularly information technology, robotics, nanotech, but that the peak oil, the important dates, that the peak oil crash was going to beat technology in a race. Now, I no longer think that that's the case. I also don't think that the changes that technology is going to visit upon this society, it has visited, it is visiting on this society, I don't think they're wholly good, and I don't think they're driven by a humanist agenda. I think that technology, particularly information technology, when compelled and combined with capitalism, particularly the form of capitalism that we enjoy now, it has an agenda of its own, which is definitely not a human agenda. It creates tremendous wealth for a few humans, and it would be very easy, in fact, difficult not for those humans to interpret their great good fortune as a harbinger of, great good fortune that will be coming to everybody soon. The William Gibson line, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. I'm sure Jeff Bezos believes that. I'm sure Tim Cook believes that the wonderful lifestyle that they enjoy because of technology is disseminating out into the general population, and we're all going to get a piece of it pretty soon. And hey, here I am talking into a nice camera, I'm going to upload it from my house from a fast internet connection, a connection that, 20 years ago nobody had. Nobody. Top generals at the Pentagon maybe had a connection like I have now. And now mine, it's run of the mill. So I'm certainly a beneficiary of technology, but I'm also the victim of the disintegration of the middle class. And, I use victim in the loosest possible context and meaning, because I do not consider myself a victim, and I definitely don't hold up, my hard experiences as some sort of bona fide, which gives me a right to talk about, say, the life of the precariat. Before she got into politics, Elizabeth Warren, when she was just, a college professor, talking about debt and the economic changes and how they have affected families, she was speaking from a position of absolute privilege, but she had done her research, and, she was pretty on target with what she had to say. What she had to say was in no way diminished by her posh circumstances. Anyway, I've gone far afield on cancel culture. Big point being, if what you have to say in order to maintain your position, either your social position or more importantly your economic position, if what you have to say to maintain that position starts to stick in your craw, you have a decision to make. Do you try to please your audience, or do you follow, the guidance of your personal sense of integrity or intellectual honesty, or whatever other standard you might hold above your material well-being? Which way do you go? If you choose your material well-being over intellectual honesty, over your own sense of intellectual curiosity, over your own creative voice, your own muse, particularly if you have dependents, if you have a wife, if you have children, maybe grandchildren, or other people, other types of relationships, but those people are dependent on your material well-being, well, then you do what you have to do. You do what you have to do. But I sure don't envy you being in that position. I complain about my position. See my teeth? Ha ha! But it's one of my own making. And if I really did prioritize my material circumstances over my experience of doing what I do, I could be in a different situation. So this is just me saying, I ain't complaining. All right, I'm going to do another video right now about MGTOWs. And it's going to be an unlisted video. Think that guy's a MGTOW? It'll be an unlisted video, but I will post it to my Patreon feed for anybody who is contributing $1 a month or more. There we go. For those folks, I will talk to you in just a minute. For everybody else, I'll talk to you pretty soon.